Hi, I'm Dr. Courtney, a veterinary surgeon out in Central California. Courageous Conversations is a podcast that is dedicated to issues of race and social issues. And the point of the podcast is to inspire you to address these issues in your own life. I am joined today by two very special guests, two of the most determined and undaunted guests within the veterinary industry. Yes, I'm joined by the hosts of Courageous Conversations, Dr. Peter Weinstein, who is the Executive Director of the Southern California Veterinary Medical Association, and Dr. Phil Nelson, Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine of Western University. Welcome both of you to this conversation about Courageous Conversations. I'm so happy to be joined with you guys today.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you for having us, Courtney.
Oh, no, listen, this is, listening to this podcast, what I noticed is there's a word that comes to me, and that word is incisive. It is deeply analytical, this podcast. It's unapologetic. And essentially, just to put it in layman's terms, you both go for it. You go for it. And I hope everybody gets a chance to hear that. What I'd like for you to do right now for us, if you don't mind, is something I call set the scene. Set the scene for us on how you two actually became friends and actually became friendly enough to have these courageous conversations. Dr. Weinstein, you can go first.
I would suggest that after Dean Shirley Johnston left from Western University, my role with SCVMA, my role with CVMA, Phil and I were in a number of meetings together. Mm-hmm. And we started having conversations about the university, about veterinary medicine. And I think it just started out as being in a common room with common ideas and just having the opportunity to talk to one another. That's what I remember, Phil.
I agree. That is exactly how we met. But I think that the way we became friends is because we have differing opinions and we learn to differ in a friendly way. We actually engaged and enjoyed debating each other. And it wasn't about who won as much as, for me, it wasn't about whose opinion carried the day as much as how much I learned in the process. And I think we became friends because we began to realize that we respected each other and that we trusted each other and we enjoyed learning from the different perspectives.
Sure. In full disclosure, I too enjoy a really spirited debate. So I get that 100%. But listen, let's be honest. Both of you are deeply entrenched in the veterinary industry and your connections are inveterate. But what was it about the two of you or Dr. Weinstein? What was it about Dr. Nelson that made you make that phone call to him specifically versus all the other people that you know?
Well, I think after observing and watching the murder of George Floyd, I was just I was speechless. I really just couldn't wrap my arms around it. And I started to watch the reaction nationally and locally and started to have some concerns about my friends and colleagues who were Black and how they were handling all of this, and concurrently looking for answers to questions, because I've been around long enough to remember parts of the civil rights, Rodney King, and a plethora of racism that's been going on for eons. But I just picked up the phone and I said, "Hey, Phil, I don't get it. I need your help. I need some clarification. Why is this continuing to happen? Why are we continuing to have problems?" And I think that's where it came from in my mind, is I needed somebody I could talk to, a friend that I could talk to help add some clarity to what was just so distressing at that point in time.
Dr. Phil, I mean, when you heard that phone call and you heard that here's somebody who's reaching out to you, pleading with you like, hey, give me some clarity to the atrocities that I just witnessed on video. All of us were shook by that. All of us were found that to be deeply, deeply maddening and unsettling. How did you feel receiving that phone call?
Well, actually, I thought Peter was going to tell you that the reason he called me is because I was the only Black friend he had.
That's possible for a lot of people. We're the only Black friend we have.
But no, first of all, that is not true. And I couldn't pass that up. Right. but I did ask him why me. I did say, I did say, well, why are you, I'm not sure I understand why you're calling me. You could have called anybody, why do you think I have the answer? And I did challenge his potential bias. The fact that I was Black didn't necessarily mean that I had the answer or was willing to engage in the answer. Now, we did know each other, and we were friends. And frankly, while he was talking, I was instantly impressed with the courage of him, for him to have to pick up the phone at that time, to say the words he was saying. And honestly, I think our friendship immediately deepened as a result of that reach out. And the only thing I could do was respond in a similar manner, give him both the credit and the trust that he really wanted an answer. And I decided that if that's the case, then we needed to enter into a dialogue without effrontery, without without the social graces, because he was asking difficult questions, and I was determined to give him the stark answers as I knew them. But I also wanted to make sure he understood I didn't consider myself an expert.
Well, yes, certainly. And you're asking, when you talk about difficult questions, I mean, this is one of the most challenging questions right here. And that is, we've all seen the moral turpitude of racist atrocities and over-policing, the victims of over-policing throughout, as you said, Dr. Peter, for eons. You even referenced, made a callback to Rodney King. So the question becomes, for a lot of people watching, is why now? What was it about that interview, that video, this moment in time that you feel not only was the impetus for you making that phone call, but also what was it, in your opinion, that's caused this national awakening with these courageous conversations about race?
I think that obviously we're in the middle of this viral pandemic. And I like to think that I feel like we're all demyelinated nerves. We are just on the edge. And I think that what happened with George Floyd hit a raw nerve, another one. And I was raised in a very open-minded, liberal community. We were very supportive, and my parents were, I excuse the term, I felt colorblind from that standpoint. And in the past, I probably would have called my dad and said, what the WTF? And we would have had a great conversation. Not to say that Phil's my dad. Could you be my dad, Phil?
No.
But it really, I think I was just tired. I've been watching this for 60 years, and I couldn't fathom why it continues to re-escalate. Now, most of the time, you never saw an individual isolated until it got to the news, and then you saw the riots and the protests that occurred. In this case, there was an individual who was isolated, and you watched for 8+ minutes. And I think that's what really pushed it for me, is you saw the rawness of what was going on, and you said, you know what, we got to stop this. I just can't fathom why we continue to have issues like this.
So Dr. Phil, when you hear something like that and you think, my goodness, it was how jarring and how brutal watching that video was, that caused this national awakening and caused this call from your friend, Dr. Peter. Why do you think that it's so difficult to have these conversations around race until they reach a boiling point, like what we saw in that tragic video with George Floyd?
You're kidding, right? I mean, it to me, it's so obvious that in one of our podcasts, we talk about why haven't we done enough,
Right.
What, how did we get here? We have been discussing this all of our lives, and
Why is it so difficult in your opinion?
yeah, well, the reason I think it's so difficult is because, first of all, uh, uh, it forces us to be introspective. It forces us to address who we are or who we aren't. It forces us to address what we've done or what we haven't done. One of the reasons that Peter called is out of guilt. He called because he was concerned about, what should I have done and how do I make that up? But he didn't realize he was talking to a man who was thinking the same thing. Had I done enough? And why is it that if we've been doing this, everybody thinks the 60s was the civil rights movement? We've been lynching people since 1900s, in the early 1900s. There has been a movement, a response to that ever since. I believe that the reason this was so bad wasn't just the 8 minutes that occurred. It wasn't just a horrifying act itself. Being veterinarians, we engage in euthanasia all the time. We understand what it means to take a life. And yet in that video, the person who took George Floyd's life seemed to have less care about doing it than we exhibit in euthanizing a dog. Humanism was robbed there, and no one can deny it. That's what was eviscerating for everyone. And I believe that it motivated everyone the same way. It's just that some of us sat on our keisters and did nothing. Peter decided to make a phone call.
Sure. And you said that just now that it forced these conversations around race are challenging because it forces us to address who we are and who we aren't. Dr. Weinstein, when you started the podcast, listeners are introduced to you where you say, I am a man here, I'm not coming to you as a veterinarian, but instead with white privilege. Drill down on us, for the listeners. What does white privilege mean to you in your life? Because, and the follow-up question is, there are people right now listening saying, I don't have privilege. I can barely afford to put food on the table. I'm struggling from end to end. Where is all this privilege that you talk about? Why don't we do this? Dr. Weinstein, why don't you mind drilling down for us on what white privilege is for you? And Dr. Phil, if you don't mind, talk to us about how do you explain white privilege to people who feel like they don't have any? Dr. Weinstein, you first.
So what's interesting is during one of the phone calls that we had, Phil asked me, so when did you first hear the term white privilege, and when did you first think about it? And I said, recently. And it's true, because I had never recognized it in myself. And once I started to fully understand the meanings associated with it, I became more attuned to the way I was raised and the benefits that I had of being white, and the fact that I didn't have to worry about different things. And Phil and I talked about the talk, and he talked about the concerns he has every time his kid left the house. And I remember some things like the episode in, I think it was 1999, 2000, with Amadou Diallo in the New York City area. And I grew up in New York, which had its own issues with the projects and everything else, and Harlem. And it's like, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about myself as being white privileged, because I just went about my life trying to treat everybody the same way, trying to be fair, trying to be balanced. And it wasn't until you start to look back at yourself and said, you did have some opportunities that others may not have had. You didn't have to worry about food on the table. You didn't have to worry about being able to go and vote. You didn't have to worry about getting pulled over by a cop and what the outcomes would be. And when we started having those conversations, I think that's when I truly realized what the definition was and where I fit into the picture.
That makes total sense. And, the talk, you mentioned the talk, and it certainly is a very salient point to me. Just in full disclosure, just this week, I was pulled over by the police twice in as matter of 2 days. So, Dr. Phil, when you think about these kinds of conversations, having the talk, how do you explain to particularly a white person who feels like they are not benefiting from privilege? How do you put it in perspective for them?
Well, I start by saying that I want to make sure that they understand their interpretation of white privilege. Usually their response is, I had to overcome obstacles too, and I had problems as well. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth.
Right.
And that is not the characterization of white privilege. White privilege is that you don't have to think about some of the institutional obstacles that some people have to overcome. It's like being on a racetrack and there are stop signs for one car before they get to the finish line, and then on the other it's just a wide open track. You don't know that there are stop signs on the other track, and so when you end up waiting for the other car to cross the finish line, you have no idea what they've gone through. Now you may have 2 or 3 signs on your side too, but you don't know how many signs there are on the other side. And so once I try to get them to understand that there are, just walking into a room, people make assumptions about me because of the color of my skin. That walking into the room, there's the danger of stereotypes coming up because of the color of my skin. Those are obstacles that Caucasians don't have to worry about. Now they might understand it if they have a Southern drawl and they have to worry about the stereotype that coincides with Southern drawls. But they have the privilege of not having to worry about the color of their skin causing a negative response to them.
Sure, I completely agree. They don't have to worry about it. And I like to remember that white privilege is relative, right? So relatively speaking, if I'm, if you're Jay-Z and you're in a room with somebody who's poor from, the Appalachia, certainly, Jay-Z is going to have more privilege. But if you put Jay-Z next to another billionaire who happens to be Caucasian, they might actually have more privilege. So it is, when you're comparing apples to apples and orange to oranges, white privilege in my definition is truly relative. One interesting aspect about Courageous Conversations, which again, I think is a podcast that I think everyone needs to listen to. This has the potential for it to go viral for all the right reasons. One of the most understated aspects about this podcast is the fact that both of you are veterinarians. And I don't mean brand new veterinarians. Both of you are deeply experienced. One is you are executive director of the SCVMA, and you're dean of a veterinary school. And so that didn't come through in the podcast whatsoever. Well, I shouldn't say whatsoever, but I think it was understated. Was that deliberate? Was that an implicit or tacit message to say, hey, listen, this is bigger than veterinary medicine? Or did you just get carried away in conversation and totally forgot to mention it?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't initiate the conversation with veterinary medicine in mind. I initiated the conversation with society in mind. And
Okay.
I think we've had some conversations about the lack of diversity in the veterinary profession and in the veterinary schools as well, but they have been secondary or tertiary to the more global issues.
Okay. I think the and I give Peter all the credit for initiating the conversation, but once we opened the conversation, once we agreed to continue the conversation, I was surprised that at the end of the first conversation, we decided to continue it. That there was no answer. We weren't satisfied, and that very shortly into the conversations, it was a mutual search that that we agreed we needed, that we were learning from each other's experiences. And then sometime after the fourth or fifth conversation, we suddenly realized that this was helpful for us, and how could we leverage that?
Yeah.
And so we did not enter into these conversations expecting to produce podcasts.
Right.
This was a self-help exercise for both of us.
Right. And I don't think a lot of people are going to start listening to this podcast expecting the level of candor and rawness that both of you added to this conversation, which is why I think they're so important. One particular moment of candor and complete rawness was a sentiment that you expressed, Dr. Nelson, and I'm going to quote you here. You said, you don't have to understand how I feel. What you have to understand, or what you should surmise, is whether or not these behaviors should be tolerated. So one of the principal starting places to the conversation regarding race usually is a foundation of empathy, understanding how somebody feels. But it appears from that sentiment that your opinion is that empathy is not necessarily as important as understanding. In your opinion, could you drill down what you meant by that particular statement? Do you think these conversations of race should be founded in a basis of empathy, understanding, or is that a false choice?
I think it's a false choice. I always I think that in that conversation, I wasn't trying to dismiss the importance of empathy, but I think you've always heard people respond when Clinton reached across to a young lady and said, "I feel your pain."
Right.
I think empathy is important, but I've also heard the response, "You can't know how I feel. You've never been in that position." Mm-hmm. And I was trying to counter that essentially castrates any effort that somebody might make to try to help, to try to achieve an understanding. And what they really want is an understanding. And so what I was trying to say was, you don't have to know exactly how I feel. What you need to understand is whether the act is first appropriate, and secondly, does it cause undue discomfort? You don't necessarily have to feel the discomfort, but you need to recognize it. You ought to be able to come up with something similar, in order to say, I think I know how you feel, So I'm not trying to dismiss empathy, but I also don't think that that you have to have an exact replication of anybody's response to know that something's wrong.
Sure. Dr. Weinstein, one of the what I thought punchy lines and very honest lines from Dr. Nelson was that we keep coming at this conversation through a racial perspective instead of a human perspective. When we're having conversations about race, in your opinion, is it more important to share these opinions coming from a human perspective, that we share a common humanity, or do you think it's important to emphasize what makes us beautiful in that interaction is that we are different and that we have specific differences? So is it shared humanity, that commonality, or is it the idea that we are heterogeneous, we are actually different, and that's what makes this beautiful?
I think it's the humanism. I think that these conversations have taught me so much about myself and about the world that I've been raised in. And it's been at the humanistic side of things. The racist side has been a significant portion of the conversation, but I think that we are disrespectful to people within our own colors and our own races and across color. I think man's inhumanity to man is part of where my challenges come from. I see it in line, I see it driving, I see it on the news and in TV shows, and I think we've almost de-evolved in many ways, and we've lost the fact that the people standing next to you, standing with you, are human beings as well.
Sure, sure. One aspect about this podcast I think is so enjoyable is your callbacks and references to historical parallels to what we're seeing right now. That was something that I truly enjoyed. And I thought that that also was emblematic of the national conversation and the awakening that we've seen in the wake of George Floyd, where we saw an intergenerational interest in talking about these issues. People, millennials, Gen Zers, boomers, all coming together to say, hey, enough is enough. Besides, or please expound on this, but besides the intergenerational aspects of courageous conversations, what other reasons do you think that are particularly interesting or special about the podcast that you guys have?
Yeah, well, I think you've already said it. These are real conversations. These were not when you listen to this to these podcasts, these were not scripted beforehand. Mm-hmm. And as such, and we forced an honesty with each other about these issues. And so there's optimism in some of these discussions as well. We didn't just talk about the problems. We talked about expectations, and we did talk about generational differences, the fact that the temporal timeline isn't always appreciated, as well as geographical differences in the country, and race relations, and human relations. We talked about psychology, developmental psychology in these podcasts. Like most conversations, we went all over the place, and we tried to focus those comments on minor topics so that the podcast didn't drift too much, but the actual conversations were 2 or 3 hours long. There were times when we had to go because we had to cook for our wives, and they, but we could have kept talking. And our wives will tell you that we don't cook. So I'm sorry, but at least that's the excuse I got from Peter, when we had been talking for 2 hours.
Actually, Courtney, one of the more common lines I used is, Phil, I got to take a pee.
These conversations are 3 hours long. That is something behind the scenes I don't think a lot of people realize, and they have been distilled and refined down to something that is, I think, truly powerful. Dr. Weinstein, what do you think are some of the most powerful aspects of this courageous conversation?
I think Phil made me feel uncomfortable at times. He stripped me bare, metaphorically. And
the metaphor, yes.
And I think that he challenged me to think about things in a different way,
right,
in a better way. And I asked for guidance, and I took some suggestions of books to read, movies to watch, things to do, so that I could have a better historical understanding and a better personal understanding of what's going on. And we haven't released the podcast that came up recently where we talked about the theory's roots, which came out in 1977. Courtney, you weren't even born then.
Guilty as charged, yes.
And I never watched it. I grew up, I was at undergrad at that point in time, and I had never watched the series. And so we had a lengthy conversation about a show like that and other things. There's been a tremendous amount of political discussion that you'll never hear. But I think that the most relevant part of the experience was my willingness to listen, to be heard. I think that's the greatest part of a conversation, is the willingness to listen first and to be heard.
Speaking about being heard, there is one aspect, Dr. Phil, that I think it's important when we're having these courageous conversations. We talk about the impetus and the spark which sparked this national awakening in these conversations, names like Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and all of those three individuals, and Walter Scott, we can go on and on, all of those individuals identified as African American. My question to you is, when we're having these courageous conversations, and let's be clear, they're happening all across the country, do you think it's helpful and important to involve other instances of discrimination against other minority groups? Or is there a fear that the specific experience, the specific African-American experience, will be subsumed under a larger conversation of discrimination?
So you've asked me two questions, and the first is absolutely we need to include all injustices to all people. And the second question is there a fear that the African American experience might be consumed by those other issues? Of course there is. Whether it's rational or not is the other question, because for some reason the antipathy to African Americans seems to be so intense that I don't see how it can be consumed by anything. I think, however, I'm comfortable with this discussion because I'm able to split hairs. I'm able to parse problems and to understand that you have to talk about those problems one at a time. You know, the problem with racism against African Americanism is the term African Americanism. It's really racism against dark skin.
Right.
You know, and Black Asian Indians have the same problem. You know, in the South, if you have a drop of blood, you're Black. So you have the same. So there are white African Americans, if you will, white skinned African Americans who have the same problem once it is known they are African American or that they identify as African American. Right. So so these are some of the false choices, some of the false labels that we play into that cause racism to persist. Sometimes we are contributors to the persistence of racism by trying to defend these labels that are artificial constructs. So it goes back to, should we be talking about humanism? Or should we be talking about the way African Americans are treated, or Asian Indians are treated, or Native Americans are treated, when all of those are artificial constructs? If you're going to look at physical appearance as opposed to social cultures, which is a whole nother way of dividing us and characterizing us. And so I just think it's important that we realize that the root of the solutions begin with humanism.
We had a great discussion about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, because in social media, there were postings in some of the social media sites that I was receiving that was deflecting from the Black Lives Matter discussion. And Phil and I had some really good discussions about the importance of focusing right now on the Black Lives Matter discussion. And we do realize that there are other people of color and other other groups that we need to be aware of as well. But right now, after 400 years of ongoing slavery, and Phil's got a great quote about, how do we treat our slaves, that we have to engage at some point in time. But this is the time and the place and the hour that we need to be focusing on Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, most definitely. I agree with you that quote by Dr. Nelson is particularly jarring, and I hope everyone tunes in. I will not give a spoiler alert as to what context he was referring to when he says, how do we treat our slaves? Very, very important sentiment. But you're completely right, Dr. Weinstein. When I was just checking it out, I certainly have heard the analogy that if you are bringing awareness to, let's say, one type of cancer, that does not mean that all other types of cancers do not matter. Listen, we talk a little bit about expectations, and that's really important. So I really tried to divide this into a dichotomous way to handle these issues. One is truth telling, the other is reconciliation. And one thing I think is really important in this Courageous Conversation podcast is that you both did a lot of truth telling, raw, candid, but then you also had some elements of reconciliation as well. Dr. Weinstein, if there's somebody listening to your podcast or listening to Courageous Conversations, they're like, you know what? This makes me want to take action. I want to have a conversation too. I've got a friend who's African-American, or I've got work buddies who are African-American, and I just want to have a conversation like this. What would be your advice to them? How do they broach this sensitive issue?
I think you pull the Band-Aid off quickly.
Okay.
I think that you just can't slowly pull the Band-Aid off, and you basically find a colleague, friend that you want to sit down and have a cup of coffee with, or in this day and age, have a Zoom call with. But thank God for Zoom, Phil, or else we would have had a very hard time recording these conversations.
Zoom CEO.
I think you have to just recognize that it's the right thing to do and pick up the phone. Don't do this by text unless the text says, hey, Phil, I want to talk to you. Do you have time? But pick up the phone. We still have telephones that are actually telephones and not just supercomputers in our pockets. Use the telephone component of your phone, or use a Zoom call, face-to-face, mano a mano, mana a mana, mano a mana, or however we want to say it. We need to have these conversations, and you can't be shy about it. Let me just put it that way.
Dr. Phil, there are people who are listening say, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted having these conversations. It seems like all of my Caucasian friends are coming up to me and wanting to have these conversations. If they're exhausted, what would be your advice to them? And please, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but do you think it's important for them to say, listen, I need to grit my teeth because this is important. It's more important than me being exhausted. Or do you think it's simply important for them to say, hey, I'm just not the right person to have this conversation. You need to find somebody else. What's your opinion?
So if you're exhausted, take care of yourself.
Right.
If you're exhausted, if you're truly exhausted, then stop. Don't do it. Take care of yourself, because you're no good to anybody if you're not good to yourself. However, be careful about what you're saying you're exhausted about. If you're exhausted about being the answer, yeah, I get that. I told Peter the same thing. I'm willing to talk. I'm not, but don't look to me for, let's see if we can discover this together, because I'm not sure I know the answer. If I had known the answer, this thing would have been solved, right? So you're not having conversations. You're exhausted because people are coming to you. They think, give us the key. Tell us your side of the story. Why don't you learn about theirs? I mean, that a real conversation, as Peter said, is give and take. A real conversation is to be heard as well as to listen, and to listen with engagement, listen with criticism, listen with analysis, and then challenge people. Say, well, I guarantee you half the people that might approach me don't really want to engage with me. They want a 20-minute sermon. Right. They want to ask a question, and then they want me, as Peter say, to talk in chapters. Instead of engaging and saying, well, this is what both people have to have, both sides of the conversation have to be courageous enough to be honest and voice their present opinion, knowing that it might, with the expectation or at least acceptance that they might get challenged. Now that, I never get tired of that. As we said before, I'm always exhilarated by an engaging conversation.
Yes, to say that your Courageous Conversations is engaging is certainly the understatement of the year. What do you both, and I'll pose this question to both of you, you can pick who wants to go first. What do you hope that people gain from listening to your podcast? once they get to all through all the series of conversations?
Take it away, Peter.
What I hope is that they will learn to have conversations with anybody and everybody on any topic that they need to have a better understanding of. I think race is a very significant discussion point, but I think that there are a plethora of issues that need to have conversations, and whether it's in the workplace and your comfort to go to your boss and have this conversation, or as a boss to go to your employee and have a conversation. My ultimate goal, I believe, is to encourage people to have a conversation, to not take everything in, and to not hide everything internally. I think a lot of the mental health issues that we have as a people, and more specifically as a profession, a veterinary profession, come from internalization and not sharing and having these conversations. And listen, my parents, when I was growing up, they were challenged in getting me to converse. I'm classic introvert growing up, never showed my emotions. And I'll be honest, there were times in talking to Phil that, you bite your lip and you bite your tongue. And I think it's those types of conversations that can have long, meaningful outcomes. And I look forward to the time when Phil and I can sit in our rocking chairs with our walkers and continue to have these conversations. They're not that far off.
I was about to say they are very far away, but what do you hope that people gain?
So I see the conversation as a tool. And I hope that people gain an understanding of cultures that they never reached out to before. When we, and a conversation is a good way to do that. You don't do that on a national scale. You can't do that through legislation. You can't legislate hearts. If this is going to change, if we're going to change, if we're truly going to learn to be inclusive and accepting of others, then we need to understand others. And I hope, and what we're doing is nothing new. For some of the conversations, we got distracted a little bit with the backgrounds in our Zooms, and we started putting fences up because we were trying to recapture that day, that mythical day when neighbors used to talk across the fence. As bad as race is, if we were really courageous, we'd talk about politics. Because that seems to be the issue we can't talk about anymore. And eventually, I hope we get there, to where we can provide our views on politics. But I may need another partner, and Peter may need another partner, because we tend to have the same views on politics, but I need to reach out to someone who differs from me and have the same conversation. I hope we go back to human interaction and human exploration. We've done a great job exploring the Earth. We're beginning to explore space, but we're not exploring each other. And I hope that's what we begin to do.
And I want to add one other thought. As a parent, parents sometimes aren't the best conversationalists. And my daughters, who are both millennials, it's taken a long time, but it's really pretty cool to sit down with your kids and have a conversation as well. And so I would strongly encourage that these types of conversations, which have started between Phil and I based upon an episode from Memorial Day of 2020, can escalate to improve relationships, not just between two people, but even within families, to help them ultimately pay this forward to have conversations going forward as well.
Excellent. And that's precisely what I hope a lot of other people gain from hearing these courageous conversations, is the idea of hope. And I like the fact that, Dr. Weinstein, you referenced your children, because children, or a new generation, a new set of minds, give us hope. And personally, candidly speaking, I am hopeful after listening to these courageous conversations. And I think that these conversations need to continue, because I think that the children of this country are worth it. I think people of color are worth it. I think women, in terms of discrimination and gender bias, I think that's worth it. I think having these conversations is worth it. And I appreciate your candor about speaking to these particular societal issues, particularly race relations, because this is what can make real substantive change in the personal lives of many people. I want to thank you for this incredible podcast that both of you have orchestrated and organized and curated so that we can enjoy it. I want to thank you for the time to be able to interview you. I hope I get another opportunity, and just thank you for taking your time in general with everything that you're doing. And I hope we get a chance to do this again.
Well, thank you again for having us, and thank you for taking the time to interview us, and thank you for listening to the podcast. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Courtney. But I also want to take a moment to thank Phil for answering the call when I made it.
And sometimes in life, that's all you need to do. Answer the call. So thanks again. And until next time, everyone, this was Courageous Conversations.